So welcome back to WCCF Tech TV, everyone. This is Keith once again, and we're finally getting around to the final review for the SAPPHIRE Nitro Plus Radeon RX Vega 56 graphics card. Now this is quite the behemoth of a graphics card. We've already showed you in the unboxing where we went over a lot of this detailed specs of the card. Now if what you want to see is those detailed specifications on the card, feel free to hit the link up in the corner with the little card. It'll send you over there to where we do our first look and full unboxing of it, where we look at everything that the card comes with, as well as the features of what makes the card special. We're going to go ahead with this video and jump right into the full review of it, and specifically looking at performance. So we did do the full test with the Nitro Plus Vega 56. Ooh, it's going to be a mouthful for the rest of this. So we did the whole test using our X370 test bench using the Ryzen 7 1700 at 3.9 gigahertz, and all tests were performed at 1440p, being the sweet spot for this graphics card. The Vega 56 really isn't geared toward 4K gaming, and you really are buying way too much graphics card for 1080p. So 1440p is a great spot. One of the things to keep in mind when we go through this is because it carries an MSRP of $569, we will be comparing it more to the Vega 64 liquid cooled edition, which I know is considerably more expensive, but I don't have a regular Vega 64. So that's actually a good thing once you start seeing the numbers. And we're comparing it to a GTX 1080 Founders Edition, which is comparable in price, and we'll see kind of where the performance falls. Of course, there's a lot more going on with this card than just a simple reference design, even down to the point where you can easily change out the fans if there's a problem, or even use the card to control fans in the case. So I want to take a quick moment to discuss the fact that one does not simply overclock RX Vega. We did have the option, because of we were time limited to do this. I either could do optimized performance or overclock performance, but what I've ventured to do is in what I like to call optimized performance, which those who are familiar with it involves using the power tune percentage as well as adjusting voltages. I was able to leave the core clock alone, but I was able to get the core voltage down to 1000 millivolts at phase 6 and stepping 7 to 1025 millivolts. So quite considerably lower than the 1150 and 1200 it came stock. And that was able to bring the core clock from an average in the mid 13 to 1400s it was at stock to staying over 1500 megahertz. And we were able to take the memory and bump the memory on up to 900 megahertz from the 800. We couldn't quite get the 945 that the Vega 64 would get, and that does hinder the performance slightly, but as you'll see shortly in the slides, for the most part, it's fairly comparable with a voltage of right at 1000 millivolts and a power tune offset of plus 30% and a memory clock of 900 megahertz. Where does the performance of the stock Nitro Plus Vega 56 and the tuned Nitro Plus Vega 56 land when compared to this Vega 64 and the GTX 1080 Founders Edition? Well, let's take a look at those results now. Starting off with Deus Ex Mankind Divided, we see the Vega 56 coming in a little bit behind the 64 liquid cooled by a fair margin, but only slightly behind the 1080 Founders Edition once it's been overclocked. And we've got it listed here as overclocked, but think of it as our tuned settings. Moving into GTA 5 at 1440p Very High with FXAA, you see a considerable bump in performance going from the out of the box to the OC settings, bringing it very close to Vega 64, but with GTA 5 still trailing NVIDIA cards, which is quite normal. Moving into Prey at very high settings, we see the OC Vega 56 pull right in line with the GTX 1080 Founders Edition, which is quite incredible for the lower. It's such a hard thing with the pricing, but either way, you see it makes considerable gains by overclocking. It didn't do a whole lot of good for the 0.1 and 1% lows, but the average FPS came up quite a bit. Moving on to Shadow of War, we see the overclocked Vega 56 at a very respectable 63 FPS average and pulls it right in line with the GTX 1080, but again behind the Vega 64. Ashes of the Singularity Escalation shows some of the biggest deltas between the Vega 56 and the 64 and 1080, leaving the Vega 56 at its best at 85 FPS average, which is quite a bit behind, showing that a game like this you need more than just an aftermarket solution. Moving into Battlefield 1 at Ultra settings on DX11, we see an overclocked Vega 56 pulling in line again with the GTX 1080. The stock settings was quite a bit behind, but overall, once it was tweaked a bit, it became quite respectable, even putting out better low percentages than the Vega 64. Moving over to Wolfenstein 2, we see quite respectable average FPSs when compared to the GTX 1080, quite a bit behind the Vega 64 as usual, but this is a Vulkan title and we do know that it tends to favor the AMD cards quite heavily. Moving into HITMAN, we see that the overclock didn't do really any good for the Nitro Vega 56, leaving it almost 20% behind the Vega 64 liquid cooled and the 1080 Founders Edition. Moving into Rise of the Tomb Raider, we see once again the Vega 56 falling a fair bit behind the GTX 1080 and the Vega 64. But we can see that the overclock did a little bit of good there. Going on to The Witcher 3, we see quite a good bump from the overclock settings, pulling it very close to the Vega 64 Liquid Cool Edition, but not quite coming close enough to the 1080 Founders Edition. Ghost Recon Wildlands is another game that sees a good benefit from the overclock. We see the average frame rates for the Vega 56 move up to 70 from 62, putting it closer to the Vega 56, or 64 rather, but still trailing behind the 1080. Now moving into the game Warhammer, this isn't the second one, this is the first one. We see the Vega 56 pulling ahead of everything once overclocked. It's actually quite in line until overclocked. So very good showings there with that title. So the Vega 56, the Nitro Plus Vega 56 carries 3 8-pin power connectors. And this is a huge concern for a lot of people who look at this card because it does require that you use these. Tried to boot it with just 2, wouldn't come on. So big part of this is the 8-pin powered, the 3 8-pins are delivering power across a 16-phase VRM. And a lot of this is to smooth out the power delivery, more so rather than just to beef up the power delivery. And as a result, looking at the power draw figures, you see a stock Nitro Plus Vega 56 pulling 350 watts from the wall under full load. Once overclocked, or tuned rather, it pulls 385. The power draw only goes up 35 watts, but you can see it's considerably behind the Vega 64, considerably behind. And it is quite a bit ahead of the GTX 1080, but I think we can all agree that Pascal is incredibly efficient at its power or performance per watt. But still, at the end of the day, I was expecting a lot more power draw because of the 3 8-pins, but showing here that I'm not sure that they were actually necessary, but it does help smooth out that power delivery. And thermals on the SAPPHIRE Nitro Plus RX Vega 56 were out of this world. The triple slot cooler, or 2.5 slot cooler rather, did everything it was supposed to, even when tuned up and running at over 1500 megahertz consistently with 900 megahertz on the memory. The card never breached 60 degrees Celsius. Now, admittedly, this was on an open test bench, but it was so quiet and so cool that, well, actually, let's get into the conclusion and talk about that right now. So I'm going to pick it up right here. This is the monstrous RX Vega 56. It's a huge card. It's a beautiful card. Now, some people, I've actually compared this to a Chevy Silverado. It's quite interesting. It made me laugh a bit. But huge fans, a lot of power delivery options, a lot of heat sinks, RGB like crazy. This whole thing lights up in RGB, so does this. And on the back plate, this section right here lights up. It comes with a GPU support bracket, which is huge. It helps mainly because the card is so big, helps support the card. The card as a total package in itself, $569 is a lot of money, especially for a card whose reference model SEP'd at $399. Admittedly, you're not going to find any at $399. They're going to be closer to what this one's rated at. And availability is going to be cool. But I have to give SAPPHIRE credit because the card they made, because that's what we're reviewing here, not necessarily just Vega 56, but the card itself is absolutely well engineered. It's put together really well. It cools excellently. It's one of the quietest cards that I've ever tested. And to be honest, unfortunately I have to send this back, but if AMD or somebody was to say, hey, you had to pick one to send back, the Vega 56 Nitro Plus or the liquid cooled Vega 64. I'm going to be honest, I'd rather keep this one in the house because it's, to me, overall, I would rather have this even over a reference Vega 64 for similar pricing. So great card, great job by Sapphire. It is going to be expensive, but if you look at the frame rates, if you pair it with something like this is the PX 277 from Pixio, you stay within the FreeSync range, you're going to have an excellent gaming experience, and it's going to be quiet and cool. So let us know what you have to think about this card down below. This has been Keith with WCCF Tech TV, and we'll catch you all in the next video.